Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 259 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today we're looking at Ezra chapter 4 for our commentary. Now, I do have to say Ezra chapter 4 has a little bit of time that we don't know the exact where it fits in to the time frame of the events that are happening in the Medo-Persian Empire. Some people have this as the king that is after King Xerxes, Esther's husband, and others have it as slightly before. I tend to place these events happening shortly after the Medo-Persian Greek Empire's war. So, easier put, this is after the Battle of the 300 or the Battle of Thermopylae. That's where I tend to put it. But I just give this time frame difference because if you're a student of history, it's just a difficult one to place. So why do I place it after the Battle of Thermopylae? Well, because one of the things that these individuals, these Samaritans, are going to implore the king with is that the Jews are not paying taxes. And at that point, it's a very big deal, the money coming into the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, let me give this next frame of reference, and I'm just giving the commentary for the portion that hopefully you've read. The Samaritans, well, that's a name that we're familiar with in the New Testament scriptures. But sometimes in the New Testament scriptures, we realize that they're despised by the Hebrews or by the Jews of the day. And the events of this story here tells us why they were despised so much, why they were hated so much by the Jews of the New Testament. Now, keep in mind, in the New Testament, Jesus uses the Good Samaritan to say, your neighbor is the one who is right next to you. It's the one that took care of you. Which one was your neighbor? Well, the Samaritan was the neighbor because he took care of the man who had been beaten and robbed. And if you haven't heard that story before, well, we're going to get to it when we get into the New Testament. But in these events, Zerubbabel and Joshua are rebuilding the temple, and the Samaritans come along and say, hey, we want to help you rebuild. And they say, we don't want your help. And this is sort of the beginning of a real division between the two. And remember, they go out and they construct their own place of worship on Mount Gerizim. This is the same mountain that when Jesus encounters the woman at the well, she says, well, you people say we must worship in Jerusalem, but we worship here on this hill. And that's when Jesus says, but now, or he says, there's coming a time and has now come when people worship in spirit and in truth. And the reason why she's focusing on that mountain is that, again, is the mountain where the people had started worshiping the golden calf, and then later they had erected their own place, their own center of worship, because of the events that we read of in Ezra chapter 4. So, because they weren't allowed to be a part of the building of the temple, these people have decided, we're going to get even with the Jews. They can't refuse us to be a part of the rebuilding of the temple. Why were they not allowed to rebuild the temple? Because it's not only the nation being restored, but it is also a spiritual restoration, a spiritual reawakening for those of the nation of Israel. And they didn't want people who weren't wholly worshiping the Lord to be a part of the rebuilding of the temple. So that's a part of what's happening there in those events. So in this, I just have to say, they sit down to pen and write this letter to King Xerxes and to say they're not paying their taxes, but this is a rebellious city. These are rebellious people. And that's kind of a clever tactic. What they're doing is reminding the king, or encouraging the king even, to go and look up the records to see why this city was destroyed. Because this city was very difficult to penetrate, and the people were a stubborn people. And where other nations would have surrendered long before, they would not surrender. So once all of this is brought to the king's attention, he stops the work. And for 15 years, the work stood still. Now, as I say, and I'm just saying this is a difficult part of Scripture because commentators disagree. Some have it that the temple was what they were working on. Others have it that it was during the time of the walls being rebuilt to the city. And the reason why I don't believe it was a temple but was rather the walls, I believe the temple was what had worked the people of Samaria into this frenzy. But I think that it was completed by the time they got around to making their complaint or the complaint being answered. And I think that also the reason why this is before the events of Queen Esther is because the king is so easily swayed to stop the work, to turn against the people. And the 15 years, well, I think in that time period, that's when we see then Esther and Mordecai coming into that position and probably letting the work start back. As I say, it's just an interesting part of Scripture, but what we do walk away with is this lets you know why later the Jewish people of the New Testament, we see this instant disdain for Samaritans. And this is why they saw them as dogs. It's like these people, they're inbred. They are half-breeds, and they're just against us. And they're against God, and they worship God in their own way, a God of their own making. So you can see, I'm not justifying it, I'm just saying that's why, that's what we encounter when Christ comes across the Samaritan woman, and when this other Samaritan comes and asks for prayer and says, don't even the dogs eat food from the master's table? Don't the dogs get the crumbs? We see this now as the mindset, the picture, and hopefully you understood that a little bit more as you read through today's portion of Scripture or heard my commentary. Well, brothers and sisters, I hope your day has gone well. Until tomorrow, God bless.